All right, so brief introduction and to our panelists for today. So we have Professor Daniel Mendoza from the University of Utah, uh, Gordon Pierce and Hayden Oberman from 2B Technologies, and Jack Kodros and Paolo Michelizzi from Clarity Movement. And for today's webinar, we really just want to provide a primer for folks who aren't too familiar with ozone measurement, of ozone as an atmospheric pollutant, but also talk, in a bit more detail about 2B Technologies' depth of experience with ambient ozone measurement, as well as why and how Clarity has added this technology from 2B Tech to our platform for ambient air quality measurement. So without further ado, I'm going to turn the presentation over to Jack from the Clarity Lab team to give us an overview on ozone air pollution. So over to you, Jack.
Yeah, thanks, Ryan, and thanks everyone for having me. As Ryan mentioned, my name is Jack Kodros, and I work in the research and science wing of Clarity, working on some of the science air pollution questions. Today, I'm hoping to share some of the big ticket items about ozone as an air pollutant. Some of these might already be familiar to some of you, but by the end of these few slides, we should have at least just a basic introduction of what the big concerns are when we think of ozone as an air pollutant. Ryan, in the next slide, I'm just going to go ahead and give you the answers right at the start here. So we don't need to know. The two most important things I think about when I think of ozone as an air pollutant is, number one, it's toxic. It's bad for human health, and it's actually bad for plants and crops as well. The second really important thing to remember is that ozone is not actually emitted directly into the atmosphere. It forms from other gases that are emitted directly in the presence of sunlight. And so we expect ozone on sunny days in the summer and mid-afternoon. And this is really important, and it affects how ozone is regulated and controlled. So let's jump in. Ryan, the next slide. So those were the two main answers, but to get there, I'm going to go through first a common source of confusion. Sometimes we hear ozone being good, sometimes we hear it's bad. Common confusion, we'll clarify that. Next, what actually is ozone chemically? Third, why we care about ozone. And finally, how does it form and how does that impact how we regulate it? Right, next slide. So we have commonly sometimes heard of ozone being good, ozone being bad. If we recall, there was an issue of not having enough ozone and that forming an ozone hole. So here, I'll clarify that it's two separate issues. Ozone at very high elevations, and when I say high elevations, I mean above the stratosphere, well above where airplanes are flying. At altitudes, we are not breathing it. Here, ozone is a good thing. It blocks high energy UV radiation, and it forms naturally. In the absence of humans, before the Industrial Revolution, ozone was up at these elevations, blocking UV radiation, and we would like it to stay there. Now, a completely separate issue is when ozone is at the surface. Ozone at the surface is a bad thing, mostly because we breathe air at the surface, and ozone is toxic for us to breathe. Second, ozone is not really supposed to be at the surface at such high concentrations. Human emissions are greatly increasing ozone concentrations at the surface compared to what they were before the Industrial Revolution. So for the remainder of this talk, and I think most of the other panelists will be talking about ozone at the surface. Ryan, next slide. So what is ozone? Ozone is 3 oxygen atoms bonded together. When we talk about the oxygen we breathe, that's 2 oxygen atoms. This extra oxygen atom in ozone makes it toxic and unstable. You will see it written or spoken as both ozone, the English word, or O3, which is the chemical formula of the 3 oxygens. It's perfectly fine to say either. I will typically say O3 when I'm speaking a bit more technically, and ozone when I'm talking about big picture topics. Finally, we don't typically see ozone pollution in the atmosphere at concentrations we expect in the atmosphere. When we see that urban smog, it's typically actually PM2.5 pollution or particulate matter. And this means bad ozone days aren't as obvious as bad smoke days. Ryan, next slide. Okay, so that was really brief introduction about what ozone is. Let's talk about why we actually care about surface level ozone. And I already mentioned increases the risk of disease in humans. It's bad for crops. That has economic consequences with it. And third, it's very important for atmospheric chemistry. So in the next slide, let's go ahead and look at the increased risk of disease in humans. I had once heard someone describe ozone as a sunburn on your lungs. And unfortunately, I don't remember who said it. If it was you, let me know, and I'll start attributing this quote back to you. But it's something that's always stuck with me. Long-term ozone exposure is associated with an increased risk of COPD. The Global Burden of Disease Study accounted in 2019 for over 300,000 deaths in that year alone due to long-term ozone exposure. Something like 11% of all COPD deaths were attributed to ozone exposure. And it's not just premature mortality. Ozone also contributes to years lived with a disability. So something like 3.7 million disability-adjusted life years. So this is long-term ozone exposure. Ryan, in the next slide, we can also think about short-term ozone exposure. So this is going outside and exercising on a high ozone day. You may experience coughing, difficulty breathing. If you are asthmatic, increased frequency and severity of asthma attacks, and also increases in hospital admissions and absences from school and work. And of course, absences from school and work, hospital admissions also carries an economic burden associated with it. And Daniel will discuss some of that a little bit later in the presentation. As is common with air pollution issues, those populations that are more vulnerable often experience these health outcomes more often. Ryan, in the next slide. Ozone also is bad for crops and vegetation. A number of studies have shown common crops like wheat, rice, soybeans decrease in yield due to ozone exposure. And this has a huge economic consequence globally. One study predicted by 2030, crop decreases in yield will result in $35 billion. Further, effects on crops are often estimated to be much lower than what the EPA actually regulates for human exposure to ozone. Ryan, in the next slide. So the final topic I wanted to mention about why we care about ozone is it's very important in atmospheric chemistry. And I'm not going to go into all the details of what's going on because it's very complicated. But I would like to mention ozone reacts with many compounds in the atmosphere. Some reactions of ozone can actually lead to formation of even more PM2.5. So if you have a high ozone issue in your area, you may also be contributing to a high PM2.5 issue. Ozone also reacts with NO2 very quickly, and this is a hallmark of many urban air pollution issues and measurements. Finally, I'm keeping it to the basics because ozone chemistry gets complicated very fast. It's an active area of research for atmospheric chemists. And it's one of the reasons we need more ozone measurements. In some cases, we simply don't know why the ozone concentration is what it is because the chemistry is so complicated. Speaking of chemistry, in the next slide, let's start to look into how ozone forms. So I mentioned it's not emitted directly. It is reacts and forms in the atmosphere through chemistry. So we term this a secondary pollutant. Ozone forms in the atmosphere. It needs three ingredients. It needs NOx, VOCs, and it needs sunlight. So when I say NOx, I'm referring to the combination of NO and NO2. This reacts with VOCs, which are volatile organic compounds. These are big molecules made of oxygens, carbons, hydrogens, gets very complicated, but these react and we refer to them as ozone precursors. This reaction needs to take place in the presence of sunlight. So that is why you often see ozone concentrations high in the summer and in the afternoon. And once again, if it's starting to sound complicated, it is indeed complicated. Let's look a little bit more in this in the next slide. So NOx, again, emitted from combustion, cars, heating, diesel. VOCs can be emitted from human emissions like combustion, but also vegetation. So the smell of pine trees is a VOC. Finally, it needs to take place in the presence of sunlight. So think summer, days, afternoons. And then once again, if this is complicated, it is very complicated. How do we regulate something where the precursor emissions are from vastly different sources? Speaking of regulations, Ryan, on the next slide. I just wanted to end with a little bit of regulating ozone. It is indeed one of the 6 criteria air pollutants the US EPA regulates here in the United States. The standard is 70 ppb averaged over an 8-hour period. The 8-hour period is kind of an interesting number. Why is it 8 hours instead of 24 hours? It's because sunlight is not around 24 hours a day. You can see this on the plot on the right. These are actually some measurements I took in Greece a few years ago. And you can see the highest ozone concentrations are in the afternoon when the sun's out. And most importantly, you can see ozone's not a flat line. It moves about throughout the day, and it's reacting with NO very quickly. Some other implications on the way ozone formed: the highest concentrations may be downwind of urban emissions because it takes time for chemical reactions to take place. The precursors can be a mix of human and natural emissions, and once again, depends heavily on sunlight and meteorology. Ryan, final slide. So just to remember once again, if anything you need to remember is ozone's toxic and it is not emitted directly. And with that, I'll pass it over to our next panelist.
Great. Yeah, thank you, Jack, for that excellent overview of ozone. It's a good primer. And next up, we're going to have Hayden from 2B Technologies tell us a bit about how they approach ozone measurement. So over to you, Hayden.
Thanks, Ryan, and thank you, Jack, for the introduction to ozone. So yeah, my name is Hayden Oberman. I'm the sales and marketing manager here at 2B Technologies. And today I'm going to touch on the science behind how our instrumentation measures ozone, as well as give a little bit of a brief overview of our company as a whole. Next slide, Ryan. So 2B Technologies was founded in 1998 by Dr. John Birx and Dr. Mark Bollinger. That's where the 2 Bs come from. And they were atmospheric chemists at the University of Colorado Boulder. And John specifically specialized in making vertical profile measurements of ozone, which means that you'd be taking measurements from the ground level and measuring ground level ozone and putting instrumentation on a kite or on a balloon and then flying it up more towards the stratosphere and seeing how ozone measurements changed with varying altitudes. So to be able to accomplish this work, he needed to take very accurate, very portable, very reliable measurements, but because he was using a kite or a balloon, he needed the instrumentation to be smaller. So he needed to take an instrument like the bottom of the one on the right, which is your conventional ozone monitor, and then be able to shrink it into a much more small package while not compromising the performance of the instrumentation itself. So that's how our company came around, and that's been our mission statement, since the late 90s, is being able to miniaturize our equipment, make it smaller, not compromise performance, and kind of push the edges of where you can have reliable ozone measurements. And to be able to do this, all of our ozone monitors have to be powered on 12 volts DC, and then as a stamp of validity to our ozone, to the technique we use for measuring ozone, which I'll touch on later in the presentation, all of our ambient ozone monitors are approved by the US EPA for ambient ozone measurements. They're certified as what are called federal equivalent methods, or FEMs, and to get this certification, our instruments had to be rigorously tested, and then that data had to be presented to EPA, and then EPA had to approve the instrument as an FEM. Next slide, Ryan. So the measurement principle we use in all of our ozone monitors is UV absorption, and this is commonplace for all FEM certified ozone monitors. And this is an optical measurement technique. It's based on the Beer-Lambert law, where essentially what we're doing is we have a set path length in all of our ozone monitors that varies depending on the instrument. And then we're comparing the light intensity in that cell when ozone is present versus when ozone is not present. So the ozone molecules will readily absorb that wavelength of light, as shown by the absorbance spectra here on the right of the slide. And that varying difference in light intensity is what we can use to calculate a concentration. For ambient measurements, that concentration is in parts per billion. This is a very highly accurate measurement technique for measuring ozone and so that's why it's used in ambient air. And the reason for that is because there's not a lot of interfering compounds that are present in ambient air at a high enough concentration that also absorb that wavelength of light. An added benefit to using UV absorption as our measurement technique is that since it is an absolute measurement method, it does not drift very much. It requires very infrequent calibration. You know, some of our instruments, we recommend annual calibration, but some of our instruments are in the field for multiple years without receiving calibration, and they can their data can be trusted because it doesn't drift. And all of our instrumentation is designed to run continuously with very little maintenance. So there really are, you know, plug and play instruments that you can set and you can forget, and then just trust the data that they output. Next slide, Ryan. So this slide is meant to kind of show the innovation that 2B Technologies has done since the very early days in the late 90s, early 2000s, where we launched our first ozone monitor, our Model 202. We've adapted that over the years into various form factors of ambient ozone monitors that, like I said earlier, are all FEMs for measuring ozone, and it has led us to the development of our AQ Lite air monitoring package, which is right now where we focus a lot of our kind of research and development for ozone, and has also led us into developing the ozone module for clarity. Next slide. So this slide talks a little bit about how all of those various instruments that were deployed on that previous timeline are being used actively in the field. So, you know, we've got instruments that have been deployed from anywhere from on speedboats to the Arctic, on balloons, on tripods for solar measurements or you know, remote measurements, you know, at various monitoring stations, such as at a trash truck site for some of the grant projects that we've done. We've deployed them on light rail trains in Salt Lake City, which I know Daniel will talk about a little bit later in his slide. And then, you know, we've paired with lots of government institutions, such as NOAA, to do lots and lots of different types of ozone measurements for various field campaigns. Next slide. So this slide here talks about one of our latest projects that we've done from the research and development side. So, you know, we have paired with Clarity, and they came to us to essentially transform the AQ Lite ozone monitoring package into the Ozone Module, which we now, you know, are paired with Clarity to be able to measure ozone alongside all of their nodes. So the Ozone Module itself, it's a UV absorption ozone monitor. It's a single beam version, which means that it alternates between taking a reference measurement and a sample measurement in order to be able to very accurately measure the ozone concentration in the air. We have the FEM approval is from 0 to 500 parts per billion, which is typical of all instrumentation that's approved as federal equivalent method. The precision of the instrument is 1.5 parts per billion, or 2% of the reading, and that varies depending on what concentration you're measuring. If you're measuring a low concentration, that 1.5 parts per billion will be the precision. If you're measuring something on the higher end, if it's like a high ozone day, for instance, and you're getting closer to, say, 100 parts per billion, then you're going to be measuring, then the precision is going to be 2%. The limit of detection is 3 parts per billion, you know, which really allows the instrument to measure very low concentrations of ozone, and also be able to readily tell the difference as, you know, low concentrations of ozone start to grow. And then while the instrument is approved or has a total measurement range of 0 to 50, excuse me, degrees Celsius for operation, we do have a large range that it is certified as an FEM, and that's from 0 to 40 degrees. And so what that means is that if you're able to operate it in that temperature range, and you're able to do certain QA and QC methodologies that EPA mandates for an instrument to be an FEM and for that data to be considered FEM and to be able to be used in court, then we have a large temperature range where if you follow those procedures, you're able to use that data as valid. And with that, that's the end of my presentation, and I'll throw it back to Ryan so that he can introduce our next panelist.
Great. Well, yeah, thank you, Hayden, for the introduction to 2B Tech's ozone measurement technology. And clearly your work with ozone has taken you to some beautiful places, that mountain range in the background there. So yeah, next up, we're going to have Professor Mendoza share a bit about how he's been able to leverage 2B Tech's technology for his research projects in Utah. So over to you, Daniel.
Good morning, and thank you for the invitation to participate, and thank you all who are taking a bit of your morning to listen to the work that we're doing. So first of all, I always like to start with this image. Many of you might be familiar, Salt Lake County, and really along the Wasatch Front, which is the west side of the Wasatch Mountains in Utah. It's an area that's very challenged in terms of poor air quality. We generally rank among the top 10 in both particulate matter as well as ozone levels. Now, just to be very clear, those are when we have exceedances of short term. So long term, we have very good air quality. We just have certain events, just like the majority of the American West, we have challenges with ozone. And because of our unique, well, not necessarily very unique, but somewhat unique high elevation valleys, we do get particulate accumulation during our wintertime inversion. So this is a view of one of those inversion days during the winter. There's a view from our building in atmospheric sciences. We're looking towards downtown, and you can really see the haze. You can see how that affects the sun's rays. So next slide, please. So this is our air filter change date. This is really my own personal home. And we can see that normally if I was in a classroom, I would ask students to raise their hands and tell me how many months they think this took. Just so you all know, it took about 3 months for the filters to go from brand new, obviously the top image, to the bottom image there. And they're just completely clogged. And this primarily particulate matter. And if it's not being caught by the air purifier, then we're just all breathing that in. Next slide, please. So, Ryan, I'm going to ask you to kind of tap fairly quickly through a few of them. So we started first with my research group focuses on looking at environmental exposure, whether that's modeled or in this case measured using different equipment, to then lead towards health outcomes. So we do analyses on what happens, for example, during a poor quality day. How does that affect rates of asthma? To then start looking at the economic cost of it. And I'll share an example of that in the next slide or in the next few slides, to then develop enactable policy. So we work with stakeholders, legislators, to then try to understand what is something that we can do to then impact the urban landform, or what we call the urban planning. It's a catch-all term. And then we can model what those outcomes would be, and then just kind of go through the circle again. Now, this is where it all ended. Or not necessarily ended, but this was the main focus of my research team until COVID-19 hit, which was obviously, as we know, in 2020, everything changed, because then something was highlighted to us and really to everyone, which was equity. So some of the areas that are most hard hit by many factors, social demographic factors, economic factors, are also some of the ones that are worst hit by poor quality. Next slide, please. In Salt Lake County, there's a very there's substantial difference in terms of social demographics. We can see that the northwest side of the county, it has a higher minority population, lower income, and a higher percentage of blue collar workers, whereas the east side of the county, particularly the north east side of the county, is significantly wealthier, higher population of white collar workers and white population. So this just really tells us there is a very marked difference. There's a very clear east-west divide in Salt Lake County. Next slide, please. So we set out, although there are a large number within the county of air quality monitoring stations operated by our Division of Air Quality, which is obviously overseen by the EPA. We know that it's not covering the full county. That's impossible. So what we decided to do was to monitor air quality using equipment mounted on top of our light rail. And the next slide will show the map of our stations. So we have 3 lines. They were mainly developed during the time when we hosted the Olympics, when Salt Lake City hosted the Olympics in 2002. And here's a map of the rail lines, the Utah Division of Air Quality sites. Those are the yellow circles. And then the University of Utah also has stationary sites. Those are the red diamonds. So you can see that we have fairly good coverage across the county, substantially more than some areas that would be completely missing out in terms of having their air quality red. And then on the next slide, what we decided to do was also, while the rail is great and we've had those sensors in since 2015, we also knew that we would have great benefit from looking at having air quality sensors installed on top of buses. The reason for that is buses generally can go in deep into neighborhoods, whereas light rail generally goes through well-traveled routes and also some rural areas, for example. And so it doesn't really quite get the neighborhood flavor, whereas buses do go directly into neighborhoods. And you can see some of the equipment that we have there, starting from the top left. We have, and Hayden had a really great timeline, so I appreciate what he brought up, along with Jack discussing really ozone. So I don't have to talk about much about ozone, but we can see some of the sensors there, the 405, which measures NOx, and the next sensor is a 205, which measures ozone. Then we have a particulate matter sensor, and then after that we have some meteorological sensors, as well as a data logger. Next slide, please. So what are some of the benefits of using 2B tech equipment? Well, as Hayden pointed out, there are many positives. One of the things that is really very important to us is a fast response. As you can imagine, the buses are going across the city, and we can now, if you're not familiar with Salt Lake City, our city blocks are fairly large, so you can actually get about 7 to 10 readings per city block, because we put the units at anywhere between 2 to 5 second reading rate. The units are very durable. I did not know that some of them had been deployed on speedboats. That makes complete sense, because we are actually able to put them on buses and trains, and it's a pretty nasty environment, even though they are within that enclosure, as you saw. And we've had no problems at all. They're very easily serviceable, and low energy usage is very important, because we're actually using the electricity. With a train, not a problem, because it's obviously from power lines, but the buses use batteries. So we had to know that our equipment was not really going to drain the bus's battery very much. On our next slide, I have a map that shows, this is real-time data from about a year and so ago, and we can really see this is particulate matter, not necessarily ozone at the moment, but just shows you how different the air quality is just throughout the county. We can see that in some areas the PM 2.5 values are very low, whereas as you start to get towards, remember, the Northwest is the more social demographically challenged area, you can see that it's already in the yellow air quality. This is color coded by what we know as air quality index, or AQI. The next slide, I wanted to show, this is ozone. We had a campaign with NOAA, and we had a citizen science campaign, as well as we included some of the data. This is one of the buses that's going on the west side of uh, Salt Lake County, and we can really see, first of all, the heat and the ozone readings. And oh, sorry, no, those are just the ozone readings at both 9 a.m. and 1 p.m. We can really see some of the chemistry that's going on that Jack was bringing up. Really close to the highways because of the NOx that's emitted from vehicles. See that hotspot there, just south, just north of the I-80 and I-215 intersection. And then we can also see at 1 p.m., that was at 9, at 1 p.m., we also see some of the hotspots there. And again, we see substantial variability, almost doubling of ozone just along this one bus route throughout that 1 hour of the day. So being able to get this level of resolution, as you can imagine, each one of those circles is a very finite. I think we had this at 5-second readings. We get to see all this gradients that we would not be able to see otherwise if we just had a stationary sensor, or even a sensor that doesn't have the quick resolution that 2V Tech equipment does. On the next slide, this is kind of going through that circle that I mentioned. We looked at air quality educational outcomes. And so what we wanted to look at is not just the high levels of ozone and particulate matter, but we also wanted to look at lower levels, primarily because when we are looking at air quality, it doesn't seem particularly dangerous. People do not take care. I always like to say that no pollution is good pollution, and these are some of the studies that we found, where we found that not only very high levels of pollution, but also lower levels do tend to have some negative outcomes in terms of education. Next slide. Here's where we can start to see some of the exposure variability. I'll draw your eye to the right one because we are discussing ozone, but if you want to glance on the left one, I'm not going to blame you. Here I've color-coded all of the schools in the Salt Lake City School District, and they're color-coded from east to west. More east is blue, more west is red. And so we have 38 schools, and you can see that there's substantial variability during the summer, and ozone at higher elevations is higher during the summer. And so again, not only do we have an east to west grade, but we also have an elevation gradient, which is part of the reason why the west side schools tend to have more issues with particulate matter because they're lower in the valley, whereas the east high schools tend to have more issues with ozone because they're further in higher elevation as well as being east. So on the next slide, one of the I don't know if we probably don't have time for this video, so we'll save it for next time. But this was a dust event, and you can really see the evolution, but it takes up a little bit too much time. Or we do. It's a great animation, but this is something where we see one of our challenges that we have. Again, this is a similar view as the first image, and we can see downtown Salt Lake City slowly being taken over by a dust event until we actually don't see any of the downtown area. This is a concern because this happened during recess time. I was on the train. It was a fairly short-lived event, about 20 minutes or so, but kids were actually out on recess. I could see some playgrounds from the train. So this is really one of the reasons why I was drawn towards doing much research in terms of schools. So next slide, please. And this is the economic impact. So putting the research into action. So we looked at 3 impacted groups. What happens when a child is absent? So schools in Utah were, and this again, 2019 numbers, they are budgeted $40 a day per student. So when a student is not available because they're sick, because likely due to poor air quality, which you did the analysis for, those $40 a day simply do not go towards the student. The average wage at that time was $23 an hour. Let's round it up to 25. So when a student is absent, then one of the family members, generally a parent, would stay home losing income of about $200 a day. And 56%, but now post-COVID, about 70% of students at Salt Lake City School District depend on free and reduced meals. Very modest amount. We said that now it would cost a family $5 per day to feed the child breakfast and lunch. So that's the family direct cost. But then the whole societal cost is really calculated with economic multiplier 2.5 times. This is again a very lowball estimate. And so what we did what the economic multiplier means is that for every dollar that a wage earner earns, $2.50 goes towards a larger economy. So the economy as a whole. As an example, if you had to get some work done in your home, let's say you're going to pay your contractor $10,000, the contractor's probably going to earn about 4,000 of that. The rest is going to go into taxes, transportation, material, etc. So when we estimated the total impact across the Salt Lake City School District in terms of school absences was nearly $500,000 a year that were lost to the greater economy, to families, and to schools due to poor quality absences. I took this data to the Utah State Legislature, discussed with lawmakers, and we passed a law in 2019 that now every school in Utah has free inhalers has inhalers for all students. So this is basically your albuterol, your Ventolin, so that when kids may have an asthma attack, they no longer have to go directly to hospital or go home and miss part of the day. So this is some of the gratifying work that we've been able to do because we're able to do this, these measurements and do the science and do the health outcomes associated with it. So that was with Representative Mar Wheatley in 2019 HB 0344. And now every school, in addition to EpiPens, which every school in the country has, we now also are, I think, the 13th or 14th state to have emergency asthma inhalers. Next slide, please. And we do want to really take a look at the human health and economic cost of air pollution. So health is not necessarily very straightforward, but it's something that we've been looking at. But there are also other costs associated with air pollution. If we know, for example, that an area does have poor quality and there's some choices, some of the things that we've seen during the COVID pandemic where people chose to stay home or people chose to remote work, there are some issues with losing capable workers because people, once they go through a summer of high level of ozone or a winter of poor quality, there is a brain drain. Some people actually decide to leave the state. There are also impacts on tourism, for example, if it's very hazy. Some tourists may not want to go to the national park. So this team put together an article that we published in Atmosphere looking at what is the overall cost to the economy due to poor air quality. And I think that was my last slide. Do we have one more? And thank you, and happy to take questions at the end. Always thanks to our funders.
All right. Well, thank you, Daniel, for the excellent presentation on the research you've done, and really exciting, always exciting to see that gap between research and policy bridged. And I think some of the work that your team has done on economic impacts and, obviously passing that bill as well. That's always a tricky gap to bridge with, and very exciting to see folks doing so successfully, with air quality measurement and air quality research. So kudos to you and your team, Daniel. All right, so next we're gonna go to Gordon from TV Tech to talk about some more use cases and applications of TV Tech's ozone measurement equipment. After the deep dive with Daniel here, I think Gordon will be providing some more type of overviews of projects around the world. So over to you, Gordon.
Thanks, Ryan. So yeah, I'm Gordon Pierce, work in sales and other bits and pieces for 2B Technologies. Prior to that, I worked for many years at the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment in the Air Pollution Control Division. And there we had some of 2B's monitors that we used for studies. So I'm going to start out following up on Daniel's, and this will be much kind of briefer overview of some of the different applications and studies where our instruments have been used. Daniel's is using primarily our Model 205 ozone analyzer, and that was developed well prior to the development of the AQ Lite. The AQ Lite came out in 2021, so we don't have a lot of completed studies yet using it. So I'm going to start out initially looking at a couple of studies that have been done using our older analyzers. So next slide, please. First off is with the U.S. Forest Service here in Colorado. They really had a need to look at secondary ozone standard and vegetative impacts, as was mentioned previously by Jack. Plant damage is quite common with ozone, and that was a concern for the Forest Service. So back in 2006, they developed, using the Model 202 and then subsequently using the Model 205 analyzer as well, a package that they developed in-house using a weatherproof box that had a data logger in it, as well as a battery, was solar powered, that they could put out at sites across Colorado in the national forests. As Hayden mentioned, all of our analyzers are 12-volt DC powered, so they're very easy to solar power and with a battery. And as you can well imagine, there are not many opportunities for line power back in national forests. So you can see a couple of the pictures here of their deployments. And you can see just essentially the box with all the equipment in it and the solar panel and the inlet off the top. So next slide, please. Subsequent to that, starting in 2015, the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment also wanted to do ozone studies around the state. We basically copied what the Forest Service had developed, similar kind of layout box. And you can see that on the upper right where the ozone monitor is there, the blue box in there, the battery, data logger. We had a cell modem in there as well. Some places we could get cellular, some places we couldn't, and we'd have to manually download the data. But really focusing on unmonitored communities and areas in Colorado and trying to better define areas where ozone is an issue. Certainly the North Front Range of Colorado is in non-attainment for ozone. Other areas are close, and there was other areas that didn't have monitoring, but modeling showed there could be concerns. So the advantage of this was we could put these out once again wherever. We didn't have to get line power for just a short-term study, especially when some of the power companies around here require months of lead time to get anything in, if they can even. So it was a really good opportunity and a way of using the older 2B Tech monitors. So let's move on now to the next slide, and we'll go more into the AQ Lite deployments and uses. And this is not a comprehensive list, but these are just some of the studies that are ongoing at the moment, or some of them have been completed using the AQ Lites. So Hitachi Rail in the UK has 3 AQ Lites. They really want to reduce emissions as part of their company goal. But the main use for these AQ Lites is actually on board the trains, looking at emissions and air quality impacts while the trains are in operation to passengers and the workers on board the trains. The AQ Lite is primarily based on our FEM ozone module, but it does as a full package. It also has a small particulate sensor, and you can add a couple of other sensors as well, such as NO2, carbon monoxide, or total volatile organic compounds. So with Hitachi Rail, they're really looking at the ozone and NO2 were some of the primary things that they are wondering about. Next slide, please. The US EPA has a number of sensor loan programs across the nation. Most of the regions have their own sensor loan program. And in particular, Region 2 has purchased 4 of our AQ Lites as part of that program. So they're available to anyone with, or the agencies within New York, New Jersey, Puerto Rico, and US Virgin Islands, as well as 8 Indian nations in New Jersey. Therefore, for monitoring, obtaining and putting out, using them themselves for whatever type of study that they want to do. So that's the purpose, is to try these loan programs, is to try and bring air sensor technologies to the public for this, either supplemental monitoring or for educational purposes. Next slide. Colorado State University has a couple of our AQ Lites. They wanted to fill in ambient monitoring gaps in northern Colorado. And most recently, we're using them as part of an EPA-supported project to create better within-city air quality maps. So as Daniel mentioned, very portable, easy to move around from one location to another for the older monitors, and the same with the AQ lights here. As you can see here, you can just hang them on a pole pretty much anywhere, and especially if you had a solar panel and battery associated with them. So this just is kind of an open view of what it looks like inside. You can see the detection, the ozone detection cell is the kind of silver box on the right-hand side. Next slide. We are also involved with AQ Earth. 2B Technologies was able to obtain an NIEHS grant to help develop some equipment, and also to monitor in 5 different communities or locations around 4 within the US, and 1 over, is in Mexico. So it's a project that aims to work collaboratively with communities to help meet the needs of those different areas. For Fort Collins in particular, we used an AQ light in a mobile environment. You can see it here mounted on top of a school district van, just to see how that would work out. And for similar to Daniel, what he's been doing in Utah for mobile monitoring. We have a similar car topper that we use to put our smaller sensor package on top of, that have been used on top of buses and trash trucks and so forth to date, but we wanted to test out how the AQ light would work in this type of situation. Next slide, please. Also an AQ Earth project. This is in the Tri-Chapter region of the Navajo Nation, so in northwest New Mexico, south of Farmington. Looking at 3 different Navajo Nation chapters, Councilor Ojo Encino and Torreon. And there's a lot of concerns on oil and gas development emissions in that area, as well as the chapters wanting to know exposures for their citizens that live within the populated areas. So these are being used to fill regulatory monitoring gaps. It's a very remote area. There is one, New Mexico does have some monitors, ozone monitors at the very north end of New Mexico there. And there is an ozone monitor at Chaco Canyon National Park, which isn't too far away from this area, but still there's a lot of unmonitored areas. So they want to see what was going on. And you can see the AQ light mounted inside just a security cage and a solar panel there as well, and battery below. Next slide, please. The University of Colorado and NOAA are doing a study focused on air quality in fire camps. And it's becoming a big issue, as looking at exposures to firefighters from particulates and ozone and carbon monoxide as well. And especially as the number of wildfires are increasing and getting worse, your air quality exposures or hazardous air quality to firefighters is getting much more of a concern. So this research is ongoing, and the study includes other portable air monitors that are being worn by firefighters as they're actually out fighting the fires. Next slide. So this is my final slide, just one of the latest ones that project we're doing. This is just getting going. There's 15 AQ lights that are currently on order to the Forest Service in California and the California Air Resources Board. Once again, really looking at wildfires. They have a cache of MET1 EBAMs, which is the big instrument in the center there, that they put out on wildfires, wildfire response. Typically, they're located in fire camps and also in communities near wildfires. There's other caches of monitors around the country as well. There's one here in Denver as well. So they were also interested, as part of looking at exposures, looking at both in the fire camps and wildfires, as to what were the ozone levels. I mean, ozone, studies have shown that wildfires can increase ozone concentrations. So they're purchasing some of our AQ lights, and you can see it mounted on the cross arm here with this EBAM. It's integrated data-wise, the data is sort of being integrated into the same satellite system that the EBAM is using to upload all the data to a cloud portal. So these are just a few of the examples that are going on at the moment, or have gone on with the AQ lights. And with that, I will turn it over to our final speaker to talk about the clarity side of things.
Great. Well, yeah, thank you, Gordon, for the overview of many interesting projects around the world. And I think just the variety of use cases that the AQ Lite and other 2B Tech equipment have been deployed in really shows, that it's considered best in class ozone measurement technology by, many reputable organizations. So yeah, with that, I'm going to turn it over to Clarity's Chief Technology Officer, Paolo, to, fill you in a bit more about how and why we've worked with 2B Tech to bring this technology onto our platform. So over to you, Paolo.
Thank you, Ryan. Yes, today we've heard about ozone pollution. We've heard about the great instruments from 2B Tech, and also about a lot of the use cases that are put to good use in research and monitoring. And so how does this all, what does this have to do with Clarity, right? So Clarity's mission is really to empower the world to fight air pollution. And what we do, next slide, please, is we work with organizations. So these are government agencies, municipalities, industrial facilities, community groups, and research institutes. And what we try to do is we enable them to monitor air quality at previously unmonitorable locations. So why there are some unmonitorable locations, we believe, is because of the cost, size, and complexity of traditional monitoring technology and approaches. So we try to enable them to scale the number of monitoring sites from many times from none or maybe a few to potentially hundreds. And how we do that is through our solution. Next slide, please. So our solution, we call it Sensing as a Service. And it's really a vertically integrated solution that is composed of hardware instruments, which is the Clarity nodes and the Ozone modules, data management software, the Clarity Cloud, and remote support from air quality experts. So it's all packaged into this vertically integrated service. So what we are really trying to do here is we're trying to streamline some of the use cases we've heard the speakers describe today, and make them really way more accessible to organizations, and even accessible to new types of organizations that have not been able to monitor air quality so far because of the complexity that goes into that. And through this approach, we've had impact. Next slide, please. So these slides show some of our projects. Our biggest project is in London. We monitor more than 400 locations as part of the BRIT London network. Another big project is in Los Angeles, California, where we monitor more than 200 schools. In Western Australia, in Perth, we also monitor 200 locations. We also have very interesting projects in developing countries that are related to capacity building, and also have networks in regions where populations are experiencing some of the worst air pollution. It is some of the impact that our solution has brought so far. And as you can see, really, ozone pollution is a really good fit for our mission. And the 2B Tech instruments are a very good fit for our solution. So what we did, next slide, please, is we worked with 2B Tech to integrate their instrument into our platform. So that they can connect with our Clarity nodes. So our Clarity nodes by default can monitor PM2.5 and NO2. And through the addition of Ozone modules, they can also monitor ozone, wind speed and direction, and soon black carbon concentration. Next slide, please. So what we try to do is really leverage the accuracy, FEM grade accuracy, the versatility, the compact size, and also the very attractive cost structure of the 2B Tech instrument And on our side, the ease of deployment, ease of configuration, and also the way that the data seamlessly flow from the hardware to the cloud and can easily be visualized and downloaded and integrated with other systems from our platform. So here we are trying to make a good partnership with 2B Tech, where the result is more than the sum of the individual parts. So next slide, please. With this partnership, basically, we are able to offer organization with a very flexible way to design a hybrid network that can measure PM2.5, NO2, and ozone, wind speed, wind direction, and in the future also black carbon concentration. Once the network is, the monitoring network is planned, which planning we support through our air quality experts as part of our service. Next slide, please. Once we have the network plan, we can really easily configure all the instruments with a few clicks on our dashboard. And here, as shown here, we can also monitor their operational status very conveniently. Next slide, please. And also, now once the hardware is deployed and configured, it's very easy for organizations to compare measurements from different locations. Next slide. We can also do some more advanced data visualization, such as looking at a correlation between different locations or instruments. Next slide, please. And we can also try to visualize not only spatial patterns and trends, but also temporal, of course, and like shown here. Next slide, please. And finally, we can also very easily integrate, download the data for further analysis and integrate it with existing systems and solutions via API. Next slide, please. So this really concludes today's presentation. We have here some contacts where you can feel free to reach out to ask questions, and I'll send it over to Ryan.
Great. Well, yeah, thank you, Paolo, for the overview of how the Ozone Module integrates with our system. We're very excited to be able to offer 2B Tech's ozone measurement equipment as part of our solution. And yeah, as Paolo mentioned, we've got some information here for anyone that's interested in learning more about this. And yeah, we are, I believe, at the hour here, so I don't know that we have time, unfortunately, for a live Q&A session. Thank you, Hayden, and others for helping to answer some of the Q&A topics in written format. But yeah, just a few wrap-up items. We will be sharing the slides and a recording of this presentation with everyone, so you should keep an eye out for those later today. And yeah, aside from that, I'd just really like to say thank you to all of our panelists for the excellent presentations, 2B Tech for being great partners to Clarity, and yeah, please feel free to get in touch if you'd like to learn more about our joint Ozone Module.
Definitely.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you, everyone. Have a great rest of your day, and we'll be in touch with the slides and recordings.